She dialed 911 because she saw a man in his driveway fiddling with a router. She called the police on a black homeowner fixing his own Wi-Fi. And what officers discovered next stunned everyone in the street. Darius Coleman lived the kind of life that doesn't announce itself. He was the man who preferred the window seat at the coffee shop, who worked from home and kept to a carefully measured routine. His house was tidy, his landscaping modest, his privacy deliberate. No cameras glued to every corner, no endless stream of notifications. He liked things private, because a quiet life often felt safer than the alternatives. One Thursday afternoon, that quiet was interrupted by the small, modern kind of frustration that feels both trivial and infuriating. His laptop lagged, video calls jittered, pages refused to load. He traced the problem to the small black box in the corner of his living room, the router. An app on his phone showed the list of devices connected. Most were familiar, his laptop, his phone, the smart thermostat. But one entry stood out, Crestwood IO1. It was not an appliance he owned. It was not a name he recognized. Darius stared at the screen. The list showed active connections and timestamps, a garbled shorthand that suddenly meant something urgent. Crestwood IO1 had been active intermittently over the past several days. Someone, something, had been on his network. He felt that prick of violation you get when your private space is breached by an unseen presence. He stepped outside to get a better signal to the router's admin page, phone in hand, and typed in a new password. He reset the network, booted the router, watched the unfamiliar entry drop off the list. It felt like slamming a door. Then he stood in the driveway for a moment, phone still warm in his palm, breathing in the summer air and listening to the distant hum of the neighborhood. Across the street, Melanie Foster was standing at her kitchen sink, partly hidden by blinds. She had lived in the neighborhood for years. She knew the rhythm of who came and went. When she saw Darius leaning over his router and tapping at his phone, something that had nothing to do with Wi-Fi stirred in her chest. Unease, suspicion, a tightening that asked questions. She watched him move slowly, felt a story form in the space between what she saw and what she imagined. He stood there long enough to make her uneasy. He was a man she didn't see often, and in a moment of fear she reached for the phone. She called 911. The operator asked for details. Melanie's voice was quick and clipped. She described a man acting oddly at his front door. She said she felt unsafe and wanted someone to check. When she added that he was a black man in the driveway, the color of the description was not incidental. It was part of the perception that shaped her urgency. She did not know what he was doing, but she felt certain enough to ask for help. Detective Louis Navarro and Officer Bell Carter were dispatched. They were trained to be polite and direct. They pulled into the street with lights off and approached the house with professional caution. Darius was calm when they arrived. He showed them his ID and explained, precisely and without flourish, that his internet had been acting up and that he had just changed his password. He offered to show them the router app on his phone. Police work often begins with two parallel logics: the social, why did a neighbor feel threatened, and the technical, what do the devices show? Navarro and Carter walked through both. They listened to Melanie's account and then stepped into Darius's living room and watched him navigate the router interface. The list of connections displayed again. There it was. Crestwood, ISO1. The line next to that device showed activity, and more startlingly, another pane on Darius's laptop revealed something the officers had not expected. Thumbnails, tiny windows of video feeds. One by one they clicked to life. A hallway light, a couch, a television screen, a child's toy left half hidden on the floor. They were not Darius's cameras. These were feeds from other homes. For a moment the room held a curious silence. An officer's head tilted toward the screen. The unnatural intimacy of seeing another person's living room flicker on a stranger's laptop is the sort of thing that lands in the gut like a physical shock. "Those aren't his," Officer Carter said quietly. The crew scrolled. The timestamps aligned with the times Crestwood IO1 had been active. "Who would set up a device named that?" Navarro asked. His tone was clinical. The question was not rhetorical. It became clear that this was no innocent neighbor accidentally linked to the wrong network. Someone had set up a network name, an SSID, designed to blend into a neighborhood. In plain language, Crestwood ISO-1 was a fake network configured to look like legitimate local Wi-Fi. When a phone or device connected to it, the connection routed through the attacker's machine. In technical shorthand, that's sometimes called a man-in-the-middle, but in this case it was enough to say, simply, that whoever controlled Crestwood IO1 could see certain kinds of data from devices that trusted it, and it looked like someone had used that position to reach into people's cameras. Then the most disturbing detail. One of the thumbnail feeds clearly matched an interior that Melanie recognized as her own living room. The couch, the pattern on the rug, the framed photo by the mantel. Melanie's hand went to her mouth. Seeing her house on another person's screen compressed a world of denial into a single cold fact. "These feeds show multiple homes," Navarro said. He called for a cybercrime support unit to log and preserve the data. They photographed the screen, made notes of timestamps and IP entries, and began tracing the source. IP logs, signal strength measurements, and timestamps can be crude tools, but they can tell you a lot about where data is moving. The officers used what they had: the local network activity, signal direction, and a map of addresses. It wasn't long before the trail pointed to a nearby house, not across town, not to a foreign server, but a short walk away. The IP address mapped to a room in the Foster household. Melanie's eyes widened. She knew, with immediate dread, the person who lived there. Brandon Foster, her 22-year-old nephew. The idea that someone in her own family could be behind this felt like a physical blow. She felt the floor of her certainty shift. No detective wanted to assume guilt, but the facts were lining up in a way that demanded action. The officers walked across the street with Melanie to Brandon's house. She led them at first, with that small, automatic protest of someone who cannot quite believe the implication. At the threshold, she hesitated. She was now both accuser and advocate in pieces of this household drama. Her voice trembled when she told the officers where his room was. Brandon's door opened to a space that matched the casual privacy of a young man. Posters, a laptop on a desk, the wash of afternoon light. The officers announced themselves and asked a few questions. Brandon greeted them with a mixture of annoyance and incredulity, the kind you see when someone is interrupted by bureaucracy. Their questions were practical and precise. They described the logs and the thumbnails. The laptop sat blinking, notifications scattered across its screen. At first he tried to brush it off. It was a prank, he said. He was testing. He'd wanted to see if he could get into neighbor networks, he admitted. The words that made the rest of the room shift were simple and small. It started as a joke. The officers recorded the confession. Brandon's tone changed when he saw the gravity register on Melanie's face. He fumbled for an apology and couldn't find one that fit. His excuse slid into an admission. He had accessed camera feeds and watched. He had kept watching. The charge sheet that would be read later was not elaborate. It boiled down to two things the law takes seriously: unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance. Those are the phrases Navarro used when he spoke with Brandon at the doorway. Short, direct, without theatrics. The officers read him his rights. Handcuffs were applied with the same clinical rhythm of procedure. For all the theatrical potential of arrests, this was a quiet one. It was precise and bureaucratic in its execution, but the emotional scope of it was wide. Trust broken, privacy invaded, a neighborhood sense of safety compromised. Neighbors gathered. Some watched from doorways, some from cars. Conversations rose, low and damaged. Melanie sat on a stoop nearby while Brandon was escorted to the cruiser. She put her face in her hands. There were tears, and there was a sound that more resembled regret than guilt, the shuffle of someone trying to rearrange a memory that suddenly does not fit anymore. Back at Darius's house, the atmosphere was different. He had been the person reported. He had stood there and shown officers his router. He had not begged for vindication. He had asked only to be left alone. After the arrest, Detective Navarro approached him with a quiet gravity. "If you hadn't checked your router," Navarro said, "we might not have known how deep this went." Darius considered that. He thought about the small acts that had landed him at the center of this chaos. Changing a password, standing in his driveway. He thought about Melanie's eyes when the feeds revealed her living room, about the way suspicion had crystallized around his being outside, He felt the warmth of anger, but kept it under check. He spoke in a measured voice. "I don't need an apology. Just do better," he said. The sentence landed soft and sharp at once. It was not a demand for restitution. It was a request, compact and human, for a different future in how the neighborhood saw one another. The scene did not resolve all the pain. Melanie's face remained drawn. She was remorseful in a way that was almost physical. Her shoulders hunched, the set of someone cradling a mistake. She told officers she was sorry. She said she had let fear do the thinking. But the admission did not erase what had happened. The technical reality here matters. Crestwood IO1 had been a fake Wi-Fi name, an SSID configured to look innocuous among dozens of legitimate networks. People often choose networks with familiar names: the street, the apartment complex, a coffee shop. And this kind of copycat name is designed to trick an absent-minded phone into connecting automatically. When a device connects, some kinds of unencrypted information can be captured. In the hands of someone doing harm, that access can let them see unsecured camera feeds, intercept some traffic, or snoop in ways that feel very intimate. The phrase "man in the middle" gets used for this sort of thing. It simply means an attacker has put themselves between your device and the wider internet to see what passes between. But in this case, the technicalities are less important than the human ones. Someone intentionally chose to watch into other people's lives. Investigators told the neighborhood gently but bluntly that it could have been worse. They emphasized that many smart devices do not have strong default security, and that our lives are more exposed than we often assume. That statement is true, but it can also slide into a kind of fear-mongering if it's not held with care. In this community, the clearer, bracing truth was social. The vulnerability that gave Brandon opportunity existed because he had the access, and the immediate harm that followed was made possible because Melanie had added color to a moment of uncertainty by choosing suspect over curiosity. The arrest of Brandon did not finish the story. It was a legal step. It was also a moral reckoning. For Brandon, the consequences were immediate and likely shape how he would tell himself this story in the years to come. It was a joke, no longer carried any comic weight. It had become an explanation that admitted a deliberate trampling of privacy. For Melanie, the personal fallout would be the harder work, reconciling the reflex that sent her to the phone with the reality that the person she had reported was a neighbor who had simply been trying to fix his home network. There were small, wattled moments in the aftermath that mattered. Officers gathered statements from neighbors about what they'd seen in the days previous: strange devices popping into lists, odd behavior on cameras, feeds that looked like someone watching. The cyber team preserved logs and images and prepared a report. The district attorney would review the evidence and decide on prosecution. For now, the moral clarity that mattered most in the block was painfully straightforward. Someone's privacy had been violated, and the man who noticed and acted on it had been treated as a suspect. A quiet conversation unfolded between Darius and Melanie a few days later at the edge of his yard. She came with a plate of cookies, a small, awkward offering meant to bridge the sudden distance. Darius accepted them without a flourish. There were apologies, halting and sincere. Melanie spoke about fear and habit and the reflex that had led her to call. She talked about the shock of seeing her own living room on a stranger's screen. Darius listened. He did not demand a performance of penance. He did not rise to the volume of hurt. He said simply and precisely the same sentence he'd said before: "I don't need an apology. Just do better." It was not a dismissal of wrongdoing. It was a call for change in the way the neighborhood related to suspicion and to one another. This story holds a few uncomfortable lessons. One is about bias. How quickly a stranger can become a threat when race, even the quiet knowledge that someone is black, becomes a lens for imagining danger. Melanie's call came from a real place of unease, but that unease was sharpened by a context she brought to the moment. A history of fear that can make people imagine malice in the unfamiliar. That is not an excuse. It's an origin. The neighbors learned in immediate ways that those origins have consequences. Another lesson is about privacy and technology. Many of our devices are porous by design or by default. A fake Wi-Fi network like Crestwood ISO1 is simply a tool, harmless on its own, until someone uses it to cross a line. The troubling part of this case was not only that a young man made that choice, but that he found, beneath the surface of neighborly trust, the tools, and the curiosity to exploit it. The legal charges, unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance, were precise because they matched a clear crossing of boundaries. Those words are technical, but their meaning is plain. Someone's windows were opened without permission. There's also a civic lesson. When neighbors feel unsettled, how do they respond? Do they reach out to check, to ask, to imagine best intentions first? Or do they call authorities and let fear define the rest? The answer is not one size fits all. Sometimes calling 911 is appropriate, especially when there's immediate danger. Sometimes it is a reflex that sets in motion a cascade of consequences. The difference is often what we do while we wait for help. Whether we make room for evidence to lead the story, or let assumption write the narrative first. Police officers in this case did what they were trained to do. They investigated the device, they gathered logs, they traced IPs, and they followed the evidence neutrally. That neutrality is important in maintaining trust in the institutions that intervene. It also mattered that Darius had not been performative in his defense. He had done the precise thing that allowed the case to be built. He checked his router and showed the officers the evidence. His patience gave the investigation its clarity. The neighborhood's reaction was not uniform. Some people expressed relief that the perpetrator was local and in custody. Others were shaken by the realization that the threat had been closer than they'd thought. Conversations about privacy began in living rooms and spilled into group chats. Some residents took immediate, practical actions. They changed passwords, they checked their cameras, they discussed what to do if they felt unsafe. That practical energy mattered, and yet it was not the whole story. The larger, quieter aftershock was about relationships. Melanie and Darius did not become close friends overnight. There was no tidy reunion or feel-good resolution. There was instead a hard, necessary conversation about how a moment of fear can be compounded by race, and how the scaffolding of trust in a neighborhood can be fragile. Darius continued to live his quiet life, but the episode lingered in the way people looked at him on the sidewalk. Melanie carried the memory of a mistake she wanted to undo. Brandon sat in a cell and waited for legal processes to unfold. The officers moved from the scene with the bureaucratic calm of those accustomed to such ruptures, but not without the knowledge that they had stopped something that could have become far more invasive. What happened in Crestwood is a lesson that sits somewhere between the technical and the moral. On one side, there's the simple fact that if someone sets up a fake network and others connect to it, that attacker can see certain streams of information. In non-technical terms, it is the difference between a locked front door and a broken window. On the other side is the human cost when suspicion picks a target and acts before evidence arrives. Here, those two strands intersected, the privacy breach that led Darius to act, and the racialized fear that led Melanie to call the police. There are no easy endings to this story. The legal system would take its course for Brandon. Neighborhood trust would take longer to repair. But there are practical human actions that matter. Speaking to our neighbors instead of at them, verifying before assuming, holding our impulses to immediate judgment in check. Melanie's remorse was real. Darius' restraint was a kind of strength. Both are examples of how an ordinary block can be the site of both harm and repair. In the days after, the community talked about what doing better looks like in practice. It looked like neighbors introducing themselves at doorsteps instead of only at emergency moments. It looked like checking in with someone before assuming the worst. It looked like being curious enough to ask, "Is everything okay?" before dialing 911 with a narrative already attached. It looked like the slow work of changing habits that were formed by fear. And it looked like a more sober awareness of how fragile our digital lives are. That awareness need not be panic, it can be steady attention. We accept a certain vulnerability when we invite technology into our homes. The point is not to retreat into technophobia, but to balance convenience with caution and to hold those who abuse that access accountable. When word of the arrest spread, some people framed the story as a simple arc: suspicion, discovery, resolution. But the truth is more complicated. It is an arc that runs through privacy and prejudice, through curiosity and harm, through small decisions and their wide ripples. At the center was Darius, a man who wanted nothing more than a stable connection and to be left alone. He became an unwilling catalyst for a wider conversation about how we see one another and what we tolerate in the name of entertainment or mischief. If there is a final human image that stays, it is this. Darius standing in his driveway on a late afternoon, phone in hand, watching the router reboot. Melanie, hands trembling at her kitchen window, a small screen showing a living room that was not meant to be on display, and a young man, handcuffed, shaken by the consequences of a prank that stopped being a joke the moment someone else's safe space was invaded. These scenes remind us that assumptions have consequences. They also remind us that tools can be used to harm, but that the greater harm sometimes arises from the stories we tell ourselves about who is dangerous and why. The arrest addressed one part of the problem. The harder work is social and continual, to teach ourselves to verify, to ask, to extend the benefit of doubt when it is safe to do so, and to demand better when bias fills the gap between observation and action. If this story matters to you, share it. Talk about it with a neighbor. Think about what it would mean to choose curiosity over fear in the next moment that makes you uneasy. The smallest acts, a knock on a door, a question asked kindly, a pause before calling for help, can change the arc of a story before it becomes a headline. In the end, the charge sheet said what the law saw: unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance. The neighborhood learned what the moment felt like, and Darius, dignified, patient, and plain-spoken, left a line for the record that asked for a simple thing. I don't need an apology. Just do better.